Thank you.
Hi, Sam. It's Lisa.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having this.
Well, folks, it's 7:30, so I think we'll get started, and hopefully some other folks will join us in the next few moments. I'm going to mute everybody right now. And just want to say, first of all, welcome. Thanks so much for trying out something a little bit new. This is our first try for doing a virtual World Above the Tetons speaker series. And I'm really excited to try something new as well. I hope everybody is adjusting to the new virtual world that we're all living in a little bit more than normal. And I hope that everyone is starting to settle in with that. Give you a little bit of outline of what we're going to do for the next hour or so, and then we'll jump into it. I want to give you just a little information about Zoom, just in case if anybody has problems, you know how to reach out to us for help. And then I want to tell you a little bit about all the new programming that Wyoming Stargazing is doing virtually. And then I'll introduce our speaker, Dani, and she'll talk about space medicine for a while. After her presentation, we'll have time for questions and answers. And then following that, we'll do our door prizes. Everybody who's present has a raffle ticket to win one of our door prizes. And then we'll also do a raffle drawing for an astrophotography print made by our very own Mike Adler. And so first, let me begin by giving you some information about Zoom. If anybody does have any problems with connectivity, or they just, for whatever reason, can't hear our speaker, or are having any other problems, there are a couple ways you can get our attention. At the bottom part of your screen, there's a little icon that says chat. And if you click on that, a window will open on the far right-hand side of your screen, and you can actually text a message to me, and we can get that answered for you. And we have Heather Hansen here, one of our volunteers who's going to be helping out with answering questions, so you can also text her directly as well. Another way you can get our attention by clicking on participants at the bottom of the screen. Then a similar window will open up on the right, and there's a little raise your hand icon. And if you do that, Heather and I will see that and try to help you out with whatever you need help with. So just let us know, and we can try to do that for you. So first, I want to thank all of our sponsors for the speaker series. Specifically for this talk, St. John's Health is a sponsor. Thank you so much to them. We also have support from Carney Logan Burke Architects, Jackson Hole Writers, Jackson Hole Travel and Tourism Board, Think Wyoming, and the Community Foundation of Jackson Hole, as well as Jackson Hole Book Trader and the Amangani, as well as several other private donors. So thank you so much for all of your support, as well as to the Wyoming Stargazing Board of Directors, who's been incredibly supportive over our full 6-year history. So like I said, I want to share with you a little bit about the new programming that Wyoming Stargazing is doing. So I'm going to share my screen with you right now, and I'm going to show you those programs. Maybe. If I can get my windows to open up. There we go. Almost there. All right. So you should be able to see my screen now. Because of the COVID-19 situation, we've made a lot of virtual programs, not just the speaker series. We're going to be hosting our public stargazing programs virtually with a camera hooked up to Mike Adler's telescope. And so on upcoming clear Friday nights, you can just click on this link and it'll take you right to another Zoom meeting where you can see live images that we're going to be taking with Mike's telescope. So thank you so much for offering up your telescope, Mike. Really appreciate that. We've got a couple other new programs as well. I'm doing a daily live series on Facebook called Mind Bending Astronomy, in which I'm sharing some information about some mind-bending astronomy facts. We're talking about quantum mechanics right now, and we'll be getting into special and general relativity next week. So definitely check those out on our Facebook page. There's a link right here for them. And then I'm also doing a weekly Zoom meeting called Ask Dr. Sam, in which you can log into a Zoom meeting and ask me any question you want about the cosmos. So that should be a lot of fun. We had our first one of those this Wednesday, and every Wednesday from 5 to 6 p.m. Mountain Time, we'll be doing that into the foreseeable future. So please join me for that. The next thing I wanted to remind everybody about is that there's still time to buy raffle tickets for the drawing that we're going to do at the end of the presentation. And we're going to be raffling off an incredible astrophotography print by Mike Adler. And I'm going to share with you that print right now. Well, you can see this. It's a beautiful image of the Andromeda galaxy in a framed glass case there. And like I said, one of the door prizes that we're going to do is also an astrophotography print, and you get to pick which event which picture you'd like. And I don't have them all in front of me right now. They're at our office, but you can actually go to our website on the shop page, and you can scroll through all of the images that we have available. And there are lots and lots to choose from. I just want to show you how to get there, and you'll get to choose which print you would like. So hopefully you'll be the lucky winner and you'll get to do that. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Carroll does prefer to go by Dani, and so when you do have questions for her later on this evening, feel free to call her Dani. And she has a fantastic presentation for us tonight about space medicine, which is her area of research as the TRISH Space Health Innovation Fellow at the University of California in San Francisco. She's also a physician of general surgery and in her residency at the UC San Diego. And without any further ado, Dani, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sam. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let me know if it... Cool. Can everybody see that? Awesome. Okay, great. So thank you for the intro. Again, my name is Dr. Dani Carroll. As Sam mentioned, I do prefer to go by Dani. A lot less formal is good for me. So, and as he mentioned, I am a physician. I've kind of had a circuitous path in life so far. I'll just give you a quick snapshot. So I'm a general surgery resident right now at UC San Diego, and I put my residency on pause to come up to San Francisco to serve as the TRISH UCSF Space Health Innovation Fellow. So I work with my research advisor closely. Her name is Dr. Einar Sawyer, and I saw her here logged in as well, to help develop innovative solutions for answering some of the especially pressing problems in space health. And you might ask, how did I kind of happen upon this whole arena? And actually, before going into medicine, I served on active duty in the Air Force and flew airplanes for a while. So this whole space health arena has really been an opportunity for me to bring everything together. And folks can hear me, just to confirm. Okay, perfect, great. All right, so let's get moving. All right, so this is a quick snapshot of what we'll be talking about in the next couple of minutes. And I'll try to leave some time for questions at the end. And before anybody asks, because people always seem to, yes, I still do fly. I came off active duty in 2010, but I still teach flying in the local area in the Bay. This was taken on Valentine's Day on an out and back. So I think once you start flying, you kind of it just becomes a part of you. So, but let's talk about space stuff. So I don't know how many of you are particularly aware or involved in anything space health related at the present moment. So I wanted to just start basic and then delve a little bit deeper into some other of the finer details. So just to start by defining aerospace medicine itself. Historically, it's a branch of preventative medicine, which is a really large umbrella, which deals with the clinical and preventative medical requirements of human beings in the human body in the atmospheric flight environment and also in space. So in regular terrestrial medicine, just to give some background, we focus on treating abnormal physiology in an otherwise normal terrestrial environment. And for a long time, the general premise has been that aerospace medicine deals with the exact opposite, which is normal physiology, but in an abnormal environment. And so with this in mind, for the last several decades of manned spaceflight, there's been a major focus on prevention in space health. But I really want to ask you if, just to consider if you think prevention is really enough. Because I think the majority of us in this field would argue that it probably is not. So now as missions are getting longer and longer, we're needing to deal more and more with abnormal physiology in the abnormal environment. As you can imagine, this demands a lot more of folks on the physician side. And really it's a complete and total paradigm shift. So this is a slide of medical conditions that have actually happened or actually occurred over the course of the last 60 years of human spaceflight. It's current as of about 2017, toward the end of 2017. And I wanted to put this in early on to really dispel the notion that astronauts are somehow superhuman or immune to the ailments that we learn to treat in medical school and that we all suffer from at various points in our lives. As you'll notice on here, the majority, or the most frequent categories are actually related to space adaptation. So things like space motion sickness, which very much is a thing, back pain related to space flight, headaches, nasal congestion. These are conditions that are actually tied to the transition of the body from the Earth environment to space, and particularly into the microgravity environment. And we use the term microgravity to define anything, essentially anything less than 1G, but really anything closer to 0G, or as close as it gets to 0G, or weightlessness. So the second most common of these kind of genres of conditions listed on this chart are space-associated conditions, things that are related to the spaceflight environment itself. So specifically headaches that are associated with elevated CO2 levels, vision impairment. There's something called space-associated neuroocular syndrome, which I'll tell you about a little bit later. And also things like eye abrasions or burns, so stuff that you would see in the primary care office or in your local emergency department, but that's different in the microgravity environment in that it's the environment itself that allows these things to even occur. And then the third most common type of condition that you'll see is medical conditions that you would normally see at an urgent care or a primary care facility. So stuff like mild allergic reactions, skin rashes, sprains, strains, etc. And so I also wanted to give a quick snapshot of where we are right now and where we're going. So as far as where we are right now, the missions themselves, we are still operating in low Earth orbit. We are primarily conducting operations on the International Space Station, and as a result, we get to enjoy the relative safety and protection of Earth's magnetosphere. If we have an emergency, we can get somebody off of the International Space Station and back down to Earth in about 9 hours. So in as much as we may not have had that luxury for our several trips that we made to the moon, or for the trips that we made to the moon back in the 50s and 60s, we unfortunately will not be having those actually moving forward, you know, on longer and longer missions. Let's see, and then into the, as we all are probably aware of at this point, into the mid-2020s and then later on down the line, we're looking at returning to the moon and then also heading out to Mars. All right. So over the last 60 plus years of human spaceflight, as mission duration and complexity have increased, so too have our in-flight medical capabilities. This is what our medical capabilities looked like in the era of Mercury, which was just single person missions, where there was just a simple pack with antiemetics and decongestants, and that was way back in the late 50s and early 60s, to a slightly heftier med kit in Gemini, and then to the somewhat intrusive in-flight monitoring capabilities that were famously included in Apollo missions, to the compartmentalized shuttle era kits, and then finally to the shift from medical kit to medical system that we've seen in the last couple of decades with the International Space Station. And so at the moment, in-mission medical care is really provided oftentimes in real time, or else with just a lot of interaction with the ground. So ground personnel can actually instruct crew in real time on things like ocular ultrasound, ocular or optical coherence tomography, OCT, fundoscopy, looking at the retina at the back of the eye, tonometry, and other things like that. There's also live monitoring to provide a really close observation of how crew members are doing. And it provides a lot of really great information. We also have the ability to store data even down to the minutia and forward it back down to the ground so that ground personnel can analyze that information and provide recommendations. And so the thing to note here is that right now our current paradigm really takes advantage of being in very close proximity and in close contact with the ground. So we can get support for day-to-day operations, we can resupply, and we can evacuate, which is, I think, the biggest contingency plan of all. So just another depiction of where we've been and where we're going. And so in the near term, as in the next several years, we are still continuing to use the Soyuz for launch and landing. I've got it up here, if you can see my pointer in the top right of your screen. And we're still using the International Space Station, and we will continue to do ISS operations for the next few years. The commercial crew program is actually also off to the races, as I would imagine you've probably been seeing and reading about in the news. And it's very exciting seeing the progress in companies such as SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin. I think those are the big three. And SpaceX will purportedly be launching humans within the next, hopefully, year or so, maybe even a little bit less, a little sooner than that. So within the next 10 years, we will have a multi-purpose crew vehicle called the Orion, and also the Gateway habitat for use on the moon. And then in the longer term, so stretching out closer to 10 to 20 years, we're talking about deep space transport and ultimately missions to Mars and beyond. Just another quick snapshot of what the Gateway itself is going to look like. So this will be a vehicle that orbits in cislunar space, so around the moon, for 30 to 90-day missions. And the goal is really to establish a very sustainable human presence on or near the moon, and then use that as a launch pad, no pun intended, for further, for future missions to Mars. So what about Mars, since we're talking about it? What we're looking at most likely is initially doing a Mars flyby and not landing, so not conducting any operations on the surface first. And that would be on the order of about a 1.5-year long mission. And then a mission following that would involve surface operations is probably closer to between 2.5 and 3 years. As you can imagine, there's an exponential increase in the complexity with involved in each step that we're taking, not just ISS to the moon, to Mars flyby, to surface operations, but also with respect to the medical care that's involved. And so the NASA Exploratory Medical Capabilities Group and others are looking really closely at the exploration class mission requirements to be able to really narrow down exactly what we'll need. And what they've identified are the 5 most daunting hazards of a mission to Mars. So these hazards are as follows: radiation, isolation and confinement, altered gravity fields, hostile or closed environments, and then, frankly, distance from the Earth. And these hazards, of course, interact synergistically. From logistical and also medical perspectives, the distance from the Earth is by far the biggest challenge. So how far are we really even talking? It's on the order of about 225 million kilometers on average. We know it's a dynamic process given orbits and everything, but on average about that distance. And that involves time delays of between 3 and 4 minutes at a bare minimum, usually closer to 20 minutes. And additionally, as some folks might not be aware, every several years, there's something called a solar conjunction where we could actually lose contact with a spacecraft that's en route to Mars for closer to 2 weeks. As you can imagine, this poses huge problems for any attempt at synchronous communication. So we need to just rethink this whole model entirely. So all that being said, a Mars mission by default cannot rely on the current operational medical approach because it is totally dependent on real-time communication with the ground right now. Right now, we require significant continuous ground support, frequent resupply, and we're pretty dependent on the ultimate contingency plan of evacuation. So then the big question becomes, how do we build a medical system that meets these needs? You know, the needs of an interplanetary mission that's 2 to 3 times as long as any previous mission, more than 500 times as far, and where there is no plan B, really. So what medical problems are we even really worried about? This is the list of 100 medical conditions that NASA's Exploratory Medical Capabilities Group has identified as the most likely to develop in flight. And not all of these have occurred before, it's important to note. In fact, very few of them actually have up to now. But essentially, these are the disease processes that the greater NASA medical community is working to figure out how to treat on exploration class missions to the moon and really to Mars. And just, you know, it's important to bring up too that this is 100 conditions. So as we all know, there are many, many more conditions that a particular person or patient could develop outside of those 100. So it's a small piece of the pie, but we really have to deal with risk and probability in this particular arena. So that's what we're looking at here. So shifting gears, now you've just heard more of an overview of a landscape of human health and human health risk in space. And so I wanted to just dive a little deeper into some of the biggest problems in space health that are currently the primary areas of focus and of deeper development. And you'll notice I'm using the term space health as opposed to space medicine because, again, we do try to focus on prevention of medical issues in the first place. And then you'll see listed throughout some comments on countermeasures as well. So ways that we can treat things after they've arisen. All right, so first, when you see photos of astronauts in space and compare them to how they look on Earth, you may well have noticed that they look a little bit puffier than usual. You know, this is Drew Morgan down here. So here he is on Earth and here he is in space. His face is a little bit puffy. This is Story Musgrave, long since retired, but so here, and then here he is in space. Peggy Whitson down here. This is her on Earth and her in space. And so you can see that there's a definite change and they just generally look puffier. And this happens because there's an overall shift of fluid in the tissues of the body from being more evenly distributed throughout your body at 1G to essentially collecting around your head and your upper torso in weightlessness. This happens usually over the course of the first 48 hours that somebody, you know, after someone has transitioned from 1G into the microgravity or 0G effectively environment. And for the medical geeks in the audience, this actually triggers a cascade of events whereby the carotid baroreceptors in the neck sense the increased pressure and ultimately cause a diuretic effect, which leads astronauts to be chronically dehydrated, essentially, after their initial adaptation to space. The good news is that this is fully reversible and it resolves on return to Earth, but it's not totally clear right now what the implications might be on longer missions. And that kind of mild dehydrated state does have some other effects as well, which we'll talk about. All right. So you all might have heard about space-associated neuroocular syndrome, or SANS, which was previously known as VIP, visual impairment, increased intracranial pressure. And you might have seen some headlines pop up in the news about different eye problems that astronauts have had. The reality is that a lot of research energy has gone into trying to figure out exactly what's going on, and no one's totally sure. What I can tell you, and I'll go into the theories, but what I can tell you is that what we see are findings that are pretty similar to what we see in the setting of known increased intracranial pressure on Earth. We see optic disc edema, we see choroidal folds. You can see the other things that are listed there. I want to draw your attention to the hyperopic shift and the globe flattening. So that's something that's pretty unusual, but we certainly see that in space, and it's up to as much as plus 175. So somebody could go from being perfectly 20/20, never had to wear glasses ever in their lives, to actually needing to have some correction while they're in space. So, and it does resolve on return to Earth. The thought right now is that it may well be, some really recent studies show that it may actually be related to body weight. And so being of a smaller frame might be protective, but those studies are still pretty preliminary. Right. So again, why does SANS happen exactly? It's not totally clear, but there are these 5 theories. One is that it's related to fluid shifts. Another is that it's related to increased intracranial pressure. Another is that it may be related to changes in cerebrospinal fluid flow or movement. It might be related to compromised lymphatic drainage. The reality is that this whole system is very complex, and so it's most likely a combination of these things. It may actually also involve changes to the venous system, the cardiovascular system as well. But we don't know enough quite yet. And so unfortunately, we're gonna have to just wait and see how things evolve over time. As it stands right now, the only countermeasure really that's implemented for this problem is space anticipation glasses. So they provide them in flight, and then in the event a particular crew member needs some additional correction, then they put them on. Another potential proposed solution is to limit salt intake, but actually a lot of crew members find themselves pouring salt on things because they have a reduced sense of smell, and as a result, things just don't taste very good. So it's kind of a constant battle between the flight docs and crew members for that. Those are some other space anticipation glasses. I think I like the first ones better. All right. And so some of you might also have heard about the internal jugular vein clot that was found recently on an astronaut on the ISS last year. If not, this was definitely something that was found, and it's been all over the news, particularly in the space medicine circles. And after it was identified, the rest of the crew was screened for flow abnormalities in the venous system in the neck. And what they found was stagnant and at times sometimes actually retrograde or backwards blood flow in some of the crew members. And this is really dangerous because a blood clot in the venous circulation could actually go straight to the lungs. And anytime you have stagnant flow, you're at risk of developing a clot. But that clot can go straight to the lungs and cause a pulmonary embolism, which would be, in a lot of settings, would be pretty rapidly fatal. Gratefully, in this case, the clot was found and was treated effectively based on the standard of care on Earth. We just happened to have those medications on board. But it's pretty clear that we've got to figure out a really good way of monitoring crew members for this and of treating them appropriately as needed. So as far as, there are some teams that are working to develop an actual protocol for routine surveillance and also potentially for prophylaxis. One fear or one concern is that there's actually increased risk among women who take oral contraceptive pills. But it's actually the standard for any female astronauts that are going up into space to be on OCPs. So that's being rethought, and there may well be some changes there in the coming months and years. A potential countermeasure, although it's not really fully tested yet for this particular application, is lower body negative pressure therapy, which is what it sounds like. It's kind of like a big device that goes over the legs that provides very gentle suction and tries to pull some of the fluid from those that had shifted cephalad back down toward the feet. And the thought is that that may provide some sort of protective effect in this setting as well, but it's kind of unclear at the moment. So it's very much a work in progress. That's actually one of the main foci that I'm currently working on right now. All right. And so we see a lot of bone and muscle changes actually as a result of prolonged exposure to microgravity. The spine elongates in the absence of load bearing, as you may have heard, and the paraspinal muscles, or the muscles along the spine, actually weaken, which has caused some astronauts to actually herniate discs post-flight, or at least predispose them to doing so. Bone strength on Earth is very much a use it or lose it type of thing. In the absence of weight bearing, the bones actually, or parts of the bone, reabsorb, meaning that they break down, causing weaker and more fracture prone bones, and then also higher levels of calcium in the bloodstream. Muscles all over the body lose strength, but particularly in the lower body, since crew members really only use upper body strength to get around and accomplish tasks. And so to prevent these changes, astronauts are required to complete about 2 hours of exercise per day. There's a combination of aerobic on the treadmill and anaerobic using the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, or ARED, it's called. And I've got some little demos here. So that's ARED. And then that's Sunny Williams. She was running, I think, the Boston Marathon or the New York Marathon. And this is kind of how it works. So there are chains that, you know, keep a given crew member attached and simulates about 0.8 G, so they can run. There's also talk of a modified spacesuit, which would potentially apply strategic loading to simulate some of the musculoskeletal effects of 1G, but they definitely aren't standard practice yet. And so they've not really been incorporated into any protocols or anything. As I mentioned earlier, there are higher levels of calcium in the bloodstream from the breakdown of bones, and unfortunately this leads to problems, including increased risk of kidney stones. There have been some improved exercise protocols that have limited this to some extent because you have less bone resorption with a more controlled exercise plan, but it's still a big concern in this environment, especially in the setting of dehydration. And some folks are actually working to develop a mechanism for providing artificial gravity during a mission. Even just a couple of hours per day might be enough to stave off some of these bone changes and to keep the cascade of events from being triggered in the first place. There are protocols that are available now actually to use to drive a kidney stone backwards from, you know, where it might be lodged in the ureter, in the tubes that go from the kidneys down toward the bladder, to drive those stones back up, which it's not definitive treatment, but it could potentially serve as a temporizing measure if a crew member is in the midst of a long duration mission and develops this problem. And then just a quick note on urinary retention. It's actually a really big problem in space that was made worse due to anti-nausea medications, or that is made worse in a lot of settings for that reason. And a lot of astronauts, both men and women, actually self-catheterize very frequently. And as a result, this increases the risk of urinary tract infections. And so a number of folks are actively trying to figure out better ways to help crew members void or empty their bladders while minimizing the risk of infection. Just a quick note on surgical disease. You know, a lot of folks will ask, and some folks on my team in past years have actually looked at this specifically. What would happen if somebody developed appendicitis in space? So let's say you're the flight doc taking care of a crew member who's en route to Mars. They're 6 months in, and all of a sudden they develop a dull, aching pain around their belly button that then migrates down to the right lower quadrant of the abdomen. It's accompanied by nausea, by just not wanting to eat anything, and then feeling just really awful, just in general. And it turns out the crew member is febrile and has these other, particular physical exam findings that would make you suspect appendicitis. We could do an ultrasound on the ISS right now, so we'll certainly have those capabilities on a deep space or exploratory mission. But as far as treatment goes, we don't really have anything available at the moment aside from antibiotics. So this might be awesome, or this would be awesome from my vantage point someday, but we certainly aren't there yet. So that all this to say, the surgical piece is very much still in the works, and so there are a number of teams. Actually, I think one additional mentor of mine is tuned in right now, and he's working pretty heavily on this particular area, trying to make this a possibility. All right. And speaking of the gut, the microbiome has actually gotten a lot of attention in the last decade or so, and for good reason, because it turns out having the right bacteria promotes health in ways that we don't even really fully understand yet, but that are actually pretty profound. So how do we preserve the microbiome of astronauts? On long duration missions, the food that they will be eating will have been irradiated, sterilized, and stored for upwards of 3 years before it's even consumed. And so gut bacteria, even on these shorter missions, have already been shown to become less balanced and more consistent among team members over the course of a mission. And so, you know, again, this is over even pretty short periods of time. So some possible long-term solutions are actively being developed at several sites across the country, particularly in labs at Duke and MIT. And so possible countermeasures actually include some personalized prebiotic therapies, and then also possibly ingestion of this device down here, which is like a capsule that then expands once it's in the stomach. And you can load probiotics and prebiotics, or at least this is the thought. You can load different substances in these arms that then, you know, can be released more slowly over a longer period of time. And it's interesting to think about the potential applications of this star-shaped device on Earth as well, not just with bacteria, but maybe with medications or vitamins or minerals, et cetera. So lots of possibilities there. Right. I don't want to spend too much time on radiation, but you guys are probably aware that the type of radiation that we're worried about in space is different from that, than what we're exposed to on Earth. Down here, we're mostly exposed to non-ionizing UV radiation, but in space, it's primarily ionizing radiation that we're worried about. And so radiation could be and has been the topic of many lectures on its own, but suffice it to say that ionizing radiation actually causes a lot of damage to the human body and to the tissues themselves. So when astronauts go to space for the first time, they often report something called the Phosphine Phenomenon, which you may or may not have heard of, but that's where they actually see flashes of light when they close their eyes. Sometimes it can actually keep them from sleeping, especially early on in the mission. And this is a result of ionizing radiation particles hitting the retina and causing these just small focal stimulation. So just kind of an interesting point. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to dig in too deeply into this stuff, but suffice it to say that radiation has been found to effectively accelerate the aging process on a number of tissues of the body and also body systems, and it appears to increase the risk of cancer and also of vascular disease. The most effective countermeasure that's really been identified so far is, frankly, shielding to prevent the damage in the first place. But several labs around the country are working on some more creative approaches. One lab in particular is attempting to develop an understanding of what makes individual genes radiation resistant. And additionally, a team in Texas is focusing more broadly on genes that can protect cells from DNA damage in the first place. And so both of these advancements would actually have really awesome therapeutic potential here on Earth as well, you know, such as maybe a cancer vaccine someday. It'd be pretty cool. So with this whole COVID-19 crisis, a lot of us have experienced firsthand what it means to be isolated and confined for what probably feels like a long period of time, or at least longer than most folks have experienced previously. And as we've seen, some people don't tolerate this very well. And believe it or not, this is actually something that NASA considers very carefully in selecting people to send on missions. So not just individual resilience, but also how somebody fits in as a member of a team. The behavioral health component is huge. And imagine being cooped up in a tin can with 3 to 5 other people that either your professor or your boss or somebody other than you chose for 3 or more years. As you can imagine, the behavioral health piece is truly make or break with respect to a team's ability to complete a mission successfully. And many of you might have seen the movie The Right Stuff, or at least familiar with the concept, you know, that the earliest astronauts were kind of stereotypical fighter jocks, fit and healthy, and maybe a little bit cocky, and maybe not the most natural fit for a really culturally diverse group to work with. But today's ideal astronaut actually looks a little bit different from that. So the name of the game is really respect and cooperation and adaptability. So it's been interesting to see how, you know, to kind of track how that all has evolved. And we can't talk about mental health and team dynamics if we don't talk about sleep. So falling asleep and staying asleep are huge problems for crews, to the point that the #1 type of medication that's prescribed by flight surgeons for crew members is actually sleep-related agents, or agents that promote sleep. And most of us know it anecdotally, but there's actually a huge body of literature that shows the detrimental effects of poor sleep, either too little sleep time or just poor sleep quality. And so these effects can range from impaired decision making to increased reaction times, i.e. too slow on physical tasks, to decreased spatial awareness, along the same lines of alcohol intoxication. And you can imagine on a spacewalk or on extravehicular activity or an EVA, this could be pretty catastrophic. What poses a particular challenge to maintaining circadian rhythm is the fact that the sun rises and sets about every 90 minutes. So it's tough to stay on a really good cycle. Our bodies use different wavelengths of light, and our eyes are obviously the kind of the entry point of this information or this data point. But we use different wavelengths of light as signals to become either more alert or to get ready to go to sleep. But when the light is cycling 16 times a day, the cues become pretty confusing and our bodies get confused as a result. So there's still a lot of very, very smart people that are working on figuring out how to better manage these issues. But we know it's going to be particularly critical on deep space missions where the effects of chronic sleep loss would potentially be even more profound. And just a little demo here of some of the things that can, pieces that can fall apart as sleep loss kind of aggregates or as it adds up. You see all these different areas that are compromised by poor sleep. It can be pretty profound. All right. And last but certainly not least, the immune system is pretty dramatically impacted by the spaceflight environment. We consider spaceflight to generate an overall mildly immunosuppressed state, but in fact, while some immune responses are blunted, others are actually heightened in response to prolonged exposure to gravity, to microgravity, excuse me, and also radiation, poor sleep, and other factors that are really intrinsic to the spaceflight environment. So all that to say, space is not very kind to the immune system. And what has probably gotten the most attention lately in the media is the reactivation of latent viruses. I think we're all amateur virologists at this point with the whole COVID thing. But after having spent some time in space, what we're seeing is that viruses like herpes and Epstein-Barr and cytomegalovirus have been identified in the blood and sputum samples from astronauts post-flight. Which is, certainly a change from their pre-flight state, and that indicates a reactivation of these viruses to the point where they're actually shedding the virus. In the last couple of years, exercise has actually arisen as a pretty promising potential countermeasure, particularly cardiorespiratory fitness and upper body strength appear to be independent risk factors actually for immune dysregulation in space. That being said, more work needs to be done, but there have been several very promising studies that suggest maybe a standardized protocol could be developed to nip that particular problem in the bud. And of course, there are plenty of other health concerns, many that I didn't even put on this list, that we think about in this environment, but I wanted to try to stick to the major ones here and not overwhelm folks. And I just want to reiterate that every single one of these advancements would be and will be useful on Earth as well. So once we solve a problem in space, we're able to translate that a lot of times to remote environments on Earth, or even pretty, populated areas on Earth. A lot of folks can benefit from it. So we definitely don't get anywhere alone. And I've been particularly fortunate to have some tremendous mentors along the way who keep pushing me to achieve more. So I just wanted to give a special thanks to the folks that are on this slide. Particularly, I'll note Dr. Einar Sawyer up here. I know she's tuned in on the call, and she's my immediate supervisor. Dr. George Pantelos, another really tremendous space researcher and mentor of mine. Dr. Millie Hughes Fulford, who I believe is tuned in on the call also. And she's actually a retired astronaut and a brilliant immunologist, and I just feel very fortunate to have her as a mentor. And then Dr. Dorit Donaville, who's in charge of TRISH, and she's a tremendous researcher as well. All right, and so with that, thank you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. If anybody is interested in learning more about space health, do not hesitate to reach out. I put my Twitter handle up here, and then also my email address. And the physician in me insists that I at least put something up about coronavirus. So stay home, take care of yourselves. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions if anybody's got them.
Thanks so much, Dani. That was awesome. If anybody does have questions for Dani, I think probably the easiest way to do it is to use either raise your hand function. So if you go down to the bottom of your screen and click on the participants button, over on the right-hand side, there should be a little place to click raise your hand. And you can do that and then unmute yourself. And then you can go ahead and ask your question.
Raise your hand.
That was very interesting. Thank you very much, Dani.
My pleasure.
We're both psychiatrists, and I wanted to ask you a couple of psychiatry questions that came up.
Sure.
No. But before that, I was actually more taken by this, the surgical issue, which was, I mean, is that a deal breaker? Because that's certainly a risk. If somebody's on a 3-year mission to Mars, that surgery might well be needed. Does that have to be solved before a 3-year mission, that issue?
So I think that's a great question. And I don't know that it can be answered as succinctly as I would like for it to be, because the reality is that there's such a wide spectrum, or a vast number of, as you all know, as psychiatrists, having gone through the whole medical training and everything, there's such a vast array of different surgical procedures that somebody could potentially need. And so there are a lot of very, very bright minds that are looking at this problem specifically and trying to figure out which ones do we need to be able to treat. Which ones can we say, oh, we'll do antibiotics as a temporizing measure and just roll the dice and hope that they don't perforate? Another piece of this is trying to figure out if we can develop some sort, and this is something that I'm personally interested in, figuring out if we can develop some sort of mechanism for intervening in a way that's procedural, but maybe not surgical. So for example, let's say somebody develops acute appendicitis and it's treated with antibiotics, but it turns out there was an appendicolith, which is, for folks that are less aware or less familiar, there's an actual mechanical blockage. So the appendix is going to burst in that setting. It's just going to happen. And so in that case, that's considered, terrestrially, that's considered an absolute indication for surgery. You'd be hard pressed to find a general surgeon that doesn't feel that way. But in that setting, it may make sense to give antibiotics, allow the appendix to rupture, and then insert a drain. Of course, that means having the capability of inserting a drain, but that may be a lot easier and a lot simpler to develop in that setting than to actually, have like a whole pop-up OR suite, because the logistics around that are just so huge.
Do you recall in the woman, I don't think she was a doctor, but maybe she was, who was spending several years or at least over a season in the Antarctica, and she had to do her own breast biopsy?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And there was also a gentleman who did an appendectomy on himself. He was a physician in Antarctica many years ago. And so, situations like those make the news, and it really makes people wonder. And interestingly, in Australia and New Zealand both, I believe, still require, and they have for several decades, still require that any physician, not anyone, but especially any physician that travels to Antarctica, have an appendectomy beforehand, a prophylactic appendectomy. And that's definitely something that's been in the conversation. But I was actually involved in crunching those numbers using this integrated medical model, like a modeling system that the folks at the NASA Exploratory Medical Capabilities Group uses to estimate risk and to figure out if it makes sense to do those things. And the risk and versus the benefit ended up being a wash. And so when you think about, like the likelihood of them developing acute appendicitis and needing to have an appendectomy in the first place versus the risk associated with unnecessary surgery, it's not an easy call. And then there's the whole ethical question, like, can you really require somebody to have an appendectomy, before sending them? So it's unresolved as of yet.
I was interested in the, excuse me for taking up someone else's question, perhaps.
Well, then wait. Somebody else is.
Okay.
Somebody else.
Yeah, this is Mike Adler. I was just curious about the actual length of time that someone has spent on the space station. What's the longest time? I guess that's maybe where you learned a lot of these issues. But I think there are people that have been up there for over a year, I think. Is that right?
So Scott Kelly currently holds the American record for the longest continuous length of time in space. He was up there for 340 days. And Christina Koch actually just recently got back after spending 328 days. There have been some Russian cosmonauts that have spent a little bit more time, but that's, those are our kind of primary two on the American side. And then there have been a whole bunch of folks that have spent like 6 months or over 6 months up there. So we're learning more and more, and you can imagine that, it's important for a lot of things, but particularly on the behavioral health side, it's been really, really helpful.
Well, Mark Kelly was at Flynn, so.
Yeah, and the other question I had, what is the size of your team? What size of group is actually worrying about all this space medicine? It's what's actually in the bigger picture here?
Absolutely. So there are folks all over the country, really all over the world, that are looking at this. There's a conference every year called, unfortunately, it's not happening this year because it was going to be in May, but it's called the Aerospace Medicine Association Conference. And there are thousands of people that gather for that. It's not just looking at space, it's looking at aviation related medicine or medical concerns as well. But the space medicine related contingent is huge. There are, and I don't know exactly how many physicians there are at NASA alone, but there are a lot. And then, there are a number of other researchers. This is actually part of why the UC Space Health program was developed by Dr. Sawyer, which was to try to gather, or at least to provide like a hub for a lot of the folks that are involved in space medicine or working on, let's say, a grant from NASA on a particular project in their particular niche, but to try to bring folks together and say, oh, you're working on that, I'm working on this, let's collaborate. And so because there are more studies that are ongoing, even at a given university, than we could even, than we even could have anticipated. So, but yes, it's all over the country. It's definitely not just me and Dr. Sawyer.
All right.
The fact that Mark Kelly was a twin, is that providing a lot of information that might not otherwise have been available?
Absolutely. It absolutely is. And there have been, I'd be happy to, I can grab the link for you. You're welcome to email me and follow up, and I can provide you some resources about that specifically. There's been a lot of information that we as the scientific community have been able to gain from the twin study. So it was a very fruitful endeavor. Not just for what Scott Kelly himself individually accomplished on the mission, but also, based on what we learned in looking at him and comparing how he aged, how his body changed to Mark, who was on Earth.
What's the most serious medical problem that's actually occurred during one of these missions? You listed many maladies, but
yeah, I would say up to now. So there was an account of, I mentioned urinary tract infections, and there are a number of conditions that have arisen that are still more on the quieter side, that maybe have not quite been released. But among the ones that have been released, one particular crew member developed a urinary tract infection that was so severe that he actually developed urosepsis. So he became very critically ill, and he ended up needing to be brought back down to Earth.
now I was going to ask if there's been any evacuations, and you're saying there has. Then,
well, I to my knowledge, I think that was the only one. Maybe I'd be happy to check into that a little bit more and get back to you with those details. I don't want to misspeak.
right? Okay.
But yeah, I think based on my understanding, that's been the most severe. That being said, this clot situation, recently, that really could have gone the wrong way. So it's good that we're aware of that now. But large clot right here. So it's like a ticking time bomb.
Yeah. I'll turn this over to someone else.
Yeah, let somebody else, and then we'll go back.
Hey, Dani, I had one quick question. Thanks. If you can hear me.
Yep. Hi.
Okay. Can you comment, really great presentation, thank you so much. Can you comment on the importance of nutrition and any of the special nutrition needs with respect to astronauts?
Sure, absolutely. There are many, but the nice thing is that a lot of them overlap with what we have on Earth anyway. You know, a large proportion of the pre-existing knowledge base that pertains to the human body in the terrestrial environment can be carried over into the spaceflight environment. That being said, we want to make sure that folks aren't overdoing it with calcium-related supplements. So, you know, in light of the anticipated bone resorption in space, nobody's on calcium supplements. The biggest thing is really to make sure that folks are maintaining a really balanced diet. And actually so I had an opportunity to spend about a month at Johnson Space Center a couple of years ago, and had a tour actually of the nutrition lab and where they pack food that's then transported up into space. And it was neat to see. It's a full team, and they are meticulous, and they go through and make sure that everything is balanced and that, you know, basic nutritional needs are met. But, you know, the other piece is, I think, specifically related to some of the stuff that I touched on. So trying to not overdo it with the salt, even though a lot of folks will end up, you know, a lot of astronauts end up adding salt anyway, to try to make things taste a little bit better. But the idea is that ultimately can lead them to be a little bit more dehydrated, or can generate this more dehydrated state, which can worsen some of the other problems that you know, that they're contending with. So does that answer your question?
It does. Thanks very much.
You
Wait,
mentioned,
you're still muted.
Abby, it looked like you had a question earlier. Do you still have one?
Oh, I did, Sam. Thanks. Dani, thanks so much for the talk. So interesting. So fascinating. You referenced all of our collective burgeoning extracurricular interest in virology. And I wanted to go back to that part because it is of interest right now. You said that, you know, aerobic exercise, upper body strength seem to have an effect on astronauts. I was wondering if there's hypotheses or understanding as to why that could be, and two, if there's any potential. You mentioned that sort of translations to sort of terrestrial medicine throughout, and I was just wondering whether there's potential translations of that,
of the exercise piece to the terrestrial setting, or
just like lessons from how that, like, observation in virology in space might translate, if at all, to how we think about virology on Earth.
Absolutely. So I think, let's see, to your first point, I don't think that the exercise protocols or the value of cardiorespiratory and, you know, fitness and upper body strength has really been parsed out fully. That study that I referenced was a really well done study. I was writing another paper recently and happened across that study and was like, oh, I wonder why this is not like more public knowledge. But it's so I don't think that the value of upper body strength has really fully been appreciated yet based on studies that have been done so far. That being said, I anticipate it's going to be explored a little bit more. So I wish I could answer more definitively, you know, because you have the same question that I have. It's like, wait, this was from like 2018. Why have we not dug into this a little bit more? You know, because maybe that's the lead that we need to really, you know, develop a really good exercise protocol. But that's actually one of the many projects that we're working on in the program at UC Space Health. So, and then your other question about, if I can paraphrase, just broadly speaking, lessons learned essentially from the spaceflight environment in immunology and specifically in virology. I think we're still trying to understand exactly why viruses are being reactivated in the way that they are. As I kind of alluded to, it's not just immunosuppression that we see in space, it's immune dysregulation. And so the immune system is heightened in certain ways. it appears that the T helper, I'm not sure how familiar you are with immunology or how extensive your background is in that, but the T helper cell function appears to be completely out of whack. And so what tends to happen is that initially the immune system is sluggish in identifying a trigger or an antigen, but once it does identify, an antigen as being non-self, it has this overblown reaction. And so some astronauts will develop rashes that stick around for a lot longer than they would on Earth, and those kinds of things. And so I guess that's not pertaining specifically to the virology piece of it. But I think as things go along, as things develop over the course of the next several years, we're going to learn more and more. And I'll be able to answer that question a little bit better.
The T helpers freak out when they see aliens. It makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. That must be it. And I see a couple of comments here. Upward fluid shift causes things like stuffy nose and lack. Yes, absolutely. Then, oh, there we go. Yeah, great.
Dani, I have a question for you.
Okay.
The XMC group at JSC, are they looking into how some of these countermeasures might change during lunar surface operations, like with respect to exercise regimen?
Yeah, I based on my interaction with folks there, and I'm grateful to be close with a number of the folks that are down there. I think it's one of those things where we're trying to, and by we I mean all of us broadly, are trying to focus on the right things at the right time. Yes, that will be necessary, but what we need to figure out right now is what exactly is happening to make it that we're losing so much strength, and that we're losing not just bone strength, but muscle strength, and how can we mitigate that even en route to the moon? Because you're talking about on the lunar surface, and that the reality is that the fraction of gravity that we're dealing with there is just an extrapolation, or is just another step of the loss of gravity that we're trying to combat even on the ISS right now. I feel like I'm not articulating myself very well in answering your question, but what I'm trying to say is that it's the same problem, just in a different form. So if we address that problem on the ISS, we'll by default address it on the moon. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, because it's kind of the same process that's happening. Just it may be because there is a little bit of gravity there, in comparison to the relative weightlessness in low Earth orbit. Is there another?
I don't know how to talk.
What was that?
Is this working?
It is. I can hear you.
Yeah. I had a question concerning the birth control for women. And I was curious as to why an implant wasn't used. Like a Norplant, one of those.
I'm sorry, you broke up there for just a moment.
Like a Norplant implant.
Yeah, so I think that as time goes along, that's going to be explored more and more. There's actually a review that our team is doing currently, looking at women's health and looking at ways to mitigate different risk factors or risk associated with different interventions that we have just kind of taken with a grain of salt or taken as standard up to now, because we may be making some things worse. So with respect to that whole vascular, like the clot piece, now that arose, that certainly is something that we're looking at more closely. And so we'll be reevaluating that. I think up to now, it's just not, I think it's been just so much easier to say, oh, okay, well, any woman that goes up to space will just be on OCPs. They'll just suppress, menses altogether. It makes it that they don't need to transport different supplies. It makes hygiene a little bit easier. And so I think for a lot of reasons, that's been the default. But we're certainly having to rethink that now. Because there are known risk factors or known modifiable risk factors for clots on Earth, right? So oral contraceptive pills are one, smoking, obesity, there are a number of other things. And gratefully, the astronaut population doesn't have a lot of those, usually doesn't have a lot of those different concerns, but the OCP one is definitely something that we can change, we could potentially fix.
So there's been, as a psychiatrist, I was curious, we noticed that there were no listings of psychosis. And it seemed like either it hadn't been studied, no one has gotten a little bit psychotic up there, but we are talking about much longer missions now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as a result, so I don't know that I can really speak to that, because what I know is what's in the public literature, and if it's not been released, it's, you know, probably for good reason. But what I do know is that that's already been something over many, many years that's been very closely examined by NASA in selecting crew members to begin with. And it's even, as I alluded to, it's even more of an issue in looking at these longer duration missions, because you're absolutely right. You know, it's one thing to be able to, you know, be on the ISS and look outside, look through the windows of the cupola back down at Earth, and, you know, there's a certain sense of safety, from what I understand, that folks experience, because, okay, well, it's right there. Even if we're not on it, it's right there. You know, but when all of a sudden you're hurtling through space and it's way back there and you can't even see it anymore, that's a different, you know, that's going to be a different thing. So it's going to be hard to, I think, to anticipate who will be able to handle that and who won't. So I think as a result, the psychological assessments and evaluations are being adapted to trying to address that situation or that question.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I think the interpersonal piece is going to be especially interesting moving forward, you know, to figure out not just how can an individual deal with those different stressors, but what does the team composition need to look like to make sure to ensure mission success, or to give the greatest likelihood that there's not going to be mutiny. You know.
Well, you know, you had on one of those slides, which was very interesting, significant decrease in deviant disruptive behavior when crews increase from 3 to 4 people.
Mm-hmm.
That's something new to me, but that sounds extremely interesting. So
yeah, I'd be happy to dig back through and to find that reference, if you'd like, because all of this was based on references and, you know, and articles and studies that have been done in the past. But if that's something,
right, but it goes with what you were just saying, that group psychology and group connectedness is going to be a big thing when you're on these enclosed, contained vehicles for, you know, 3 years.
Absolutely. So, and maybe it may even be necessary to do some like ops testing, some operational testing of a given team, you know, and to really take them not just individually, or not just in groups of 2, but actually to take them as a team and to plunk them into a similar situation or into a simulation for a month, and to see what issues start to develop, and then go from there. You know, it may end up being that's a potential that, you know, that could provide some important information before going on a mission like that. So, any other questions I can answer?
Do you see a difference in the blood gases when they go into space? And if so, does that affect their like peripheral perfusion?
That's an interesting question. I don't know of any particular studies offhand that have looked at ABGs, but I would assume in asking that you have a medical background. What was that?
A little bit, yes.
Yes, exactly. So what we would assume, though, is that there's probably an elevated PCO2. So unfortunately, one of the biggest issues actually on the ISS right now, and on any spacecraft that has been in operation up to now, but particularly the ISS, is the ability to scrub CO2 out of the environment or out of the air. So the level of CO2, and I don't remember offhand the exact number, but it's like an order of magnitude higher on the ISS than is usually recommended or even considered acceptable by like OSHA standards. And as a result, so a lot of times what happens is that an astronaut will be on the ISS, and, you know, after several days we'll start noticing, gosh, I just feel a little sluggish, just kind of a little out of sorts. And that's, you know, a lot of times that's purported to be a function of the CO2 level. But I haven't seen, and I haven't, to be completely honest, I haven't looked specifically for studies on ABGs that have been done. Most of the blood draws up there have been venous that I'm aware of, but you know, I would suspect that there may well have been some studies using arterial blood samples to run that.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry I can't answer that more definitively.
Okay.
I got one
Yeah.
question about virology. You obviously you're just talking about space medicine for the next 20 or 30 years, but you know, when we get onto other planets, Mars, I mean, the issue of microbes and viruses from there or elsewhere. I mean, I'm thinking that, you know, part of why COVID-19 is so disastrous is it's new to us and we don't have any immunity. So it just runs through our system. And I was thinking of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, that when they invaded, you know, the way you had it set up, at the end of the day, you know, we couldn't kill the invaders, but it was our bacteria that killed the invaders. So, you know, this is going to be a big issue long term. I know there's always an issue of now with trying to worry about us infecting other surfaces, and I guess you're still concerned that there are microbes on other surfaces that we don't know about that ultimately come back here and hurt us, or certainly hurt astronauts that are on those surfaces.
Maybe it would make us better.
What was that?
Maybe it would make us better.
Maybe that's true. It's like a virus enhancement exposure. You know, my hope with all of this COVID craziness is that we can try to at least gain something from the whole situation, and I hope that some of that is knowledge on how exactly viruses function and on how a new virus like this can be so powerful. You know, and can sweep across a world that considers itself pretty advanced scientifically and pretty capable. So my hope is that it's really a good learning opportunity for the science that the scientific value that it has, because we could learn a lot and you know, translate that to a lot of different areas. One of which certainly would be the spaceflight environment, but not the only one.
So has the space community that you're involved with, or in any other part of NASA, been involved with the famous newly developed Space Force?
I think we're still waiting to see how that all evolves. I personally, I've seen some emails floating around about it, but you know, and I know they have a basic leadership structure in place, but I haven't heard a lot of the specifics. So I don't actually know if it's going to be considered still under the Air Force. My experience was on active duty in the Air Force, and I remember having the Space Command, Air Force Space Command, being a component of that. And so obviously this structure is completely different now. But I haven't seen anything in the last few weeks on the structure of that and how it's how the ranks are being filled or how that all is going to be looking. But on the NASA side of things, there's not been a ton of information that's floated around quite yet. So.
Dani, there are a couple interesting questions in the chat about astronaut crews. One up at the ISS, is there a ship's doctor that's always part of the crew? And then in choosing the crews, do you know if there's any use of the personality tests such as Myers-Briggs, so that the group that's up there actually has a diversity in where they fall out in those kinds of tests?
Sure. So I'm sorry, what was the first one that you said? I see the Myers-Briggs question, and then it was
about crew doctors.
Oh, crew doctor, yes. So there are a whole bunch of crew doctors that are on the ground that are at mission control, and they rotate through in the flight surgeon spot. I'm not sure if you've ever seen a photo of mission control. There's a picture of the older one that is still available, actually, in the movie Apollo 13. But there's like basically there are seats for all these different people that are monitoring a whole bunch of different things related to whatever space mission is currently ongoing, and one of those seats is occupied by a doctor. And the role of that, and they're constantly rotating through, but the role of whoever is sitting in that seat is to make sure that anything medical is addressed as quickly and thoroughly and smoothly as possible. Additionally, the general tendency, I don't think it's really a rule or a policy, but the general tendency over the last several years has been that pretty much most of the time, if not all of the time, there's been a physician on board the ISS. Again, it's not been all of the time, but the general consensus has been for any exploratory class missions, there will most likely be a physician. It's unclear exactly what the training or what the background of that physician would be, but that there would be a physician on board to be able to handle whatever arises, whatever conditions happen to develop. And then with respect to if at any point I'm not answering these questions thoroughly, don't hesitate to email me, and I'm happy to provide a whole bunch more info. Let's see. But as far as the team selection and really ensuring good interpersonal communication to the greatest extent possible preemptively, that's absolutely something that's considered. I'm not sure if it's Myers-Briggs that's used, but it's they have a whole bunch of other metrics that are used throughout the course of not just the selection process, but also in figuring out who to put on, in what team and how to optimize those team dynamics. So that's very much something. And again, the longer the missions get, the more critical a piece that really is. So that's a great question, because it's like you're reading the minds of some of the folks there.
Well, Dani, thanks so much. It's about 8:45 now, so I want to respect everybody's time, but I also want to do the door prize drawings and the raffle. And so Heather is going to draw some tickets for us here, and I just want to show you the door prizes. So everyone who joined us tonight has a ticket in the pot for a door prize, and so some of the door prizes include these awesome stickers from Holly Sage Art. That's Mike and Erica right there. They designed these for us. Pretty awesome stickers. We've got a few of these to raffle off or to give out as door prizes. We also have one of, or a couple of, the 2017 functional solar eclipse coins that we designed for the eclipse 3 years ago. They've got a little hole in the center of them, which was the NASA recommended diameter to project a partial or solar eclipse through. We got a couple of those. We have some 5 milliwatt green laser pointers, which are a lot of fun to point out stars and constellations to your friends. We have this awesome canvas tote bag designed during the eclipse. That's a glow-in-the-dark stitching on the front there. And our eclipse logo, also designed by Mike Kavarok up there on the other side of it. And then, of course, we've got that astrophotography print that I showed you earlier. So let's start with a drawing for the eclipse coin. Heather, can you pick one for us? Oh, and by the way, if you're in Jackson, you can pick all these items up at the Wyoming Stargazing office. If you're not in Jackson and you do win, I'm happy to mail them to you. You can just email me at samuel@wyomingstargazing.org, and I can get your address from you, and I'll send you these prizes. All right. So the first eclipse coin goes to Gary Silverberg. Good job, Gary. Yeah, and can we do another one? The next eclipse coin goes to my mom, Linda Wasserman. We'll do one of the laser pointers now. Okay. First laser pointer goes to James O'Brien. Congrats, James.
Thank you.
Do one more laser pointer. Rachel Ravitz. Nice work. All right, and now we'll do one of those Eclipse stickers. First one goes to Darby Rice. You get this one right here, Darby. Do a few more of those. Steve Singer, my dad. He gets this one. Couple more. Brian Lehan. You get this one, Brian. And the last sticker goes to Mary O'Brien. There you go, Mary. All right, so now for the tote bag. Do a drawing for the tote bag. Rachel Ravitz. All right, so the last door prize is going to be for that astrophotography print that we've got right here. That's in a glass case, glass frame, and the lucky winner there, Abigail Ridgway. Nice work. All right, so we're going to draw one more raffle ticket now. So separate from the door prizes, people who actually bought raffle tickets in addition, we're going to do another drawing for another one of those prints. And you get a choice of about 20 different prints, and we can communicate that afterwards. Raffle tickets are also good to win a one-night stay at the Amangani, good through the rest of 2020, and I have a feeling they might be extending that for us into 2021. And we'll draw that raffle ticket winner at the end of the final speaker series event 1 month from now on April 27th, which is with Dr. Mike Brotherton, who studies quasars and writes science fiction stories. So definitely join us again in a month for that event, and we'll draw the winner for the Amangani. But for the other astrophotography prints, we've got Lucky Steve, Steve Singer, my dad.
I kind of expected that. Thanks, Sam.
Well, everybody, thanks so much for joining us. This was a lot of fun. I hope you're making the best of spending more time at home. I have been doing so over the past week. I really enjoy kind of more relaxed attire. So I just want to show you what I've got on right now. Even though I'm wearing a sports coat, I'm also wearing pajama pants. Quite comfortable. So some kind of advantages you can get from working from home and social isolation. So there are some good benefits. So thanks again for joining us. If you do have any more questions for Dani, you can send them my way and I can pass them along to her. We can't really do a round of applause because there'll be way too much feedback if we all unmute, but we can all individually give Dani one more round of applause, which he'll be able to see. And
thank you, everyone.
I hope everybody has a great evening. Feel free to unmute to say goodbye if you like. And we'll hopefully see everybody next time for Mike Brotherton's presentation on quasars and storytelling.
That worked well.
Thank you, Sam.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you so much. It was terrific. Really good.
Well, yeah.
Good.